Hi there, so we're once again shooting a video as we do every time we put a new issue of the Medical Post tablet out, and I'm Colin Leslie, Editor-in-Chief of the Medical Post.
And I'm Tristan Bronca, the staff writer at the Medical Post.
So let's get to our first topic, which is Ontario fee fight.
So one of the things that doctors have been talking about now is the fact that some doctors are claiming that doctors in Ontario are some of the lowest paid, but as we know from the CIHI data, the average salary for an Ontario doctor last year was actually the highest in terms of gross, which was $368,000. I'm just wondering, how do you square those two things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is when you just look at purely how much Ontario doctors are compensated, and they do have to pay their overhead out of that 368 average compensation, thousand compensation. The Canadian Institute for Health Information does say that on that standard they are the top compensated in Canada. But when you look at how it's actually a little more complicated than that, because if you look at how many services doctors provide, doctors don't actually provide the same number of services in different provinces, and Ontario doctors provide a higher than average number of services. So we actually did this huge chart, I'll just grab it for a second, where we took, CIHI does these things called the FTE numbers, where they basically try to create a standard unit of work for every doctor. And when you look at that, you actually do come up that family doctors have are least compensated for that standard when you look at how much levels of work are being done. So, you know, it's a tricky thing. I think they've got a valid point when they say it's not fair to just look at that one number. You know, if I was working 8 hours a day and you were working 6 hours a day, and my compensation was higher, but I was paid slightly less, it's a tricky thing to look at that way.
I don't know if you have these sorts of numbers, but is there a full-time equivalent sort of number for specialists as well, or is the only one we have access to for family
There
physicians?
is. We actually broke them down for the I think 19 or so specialists that CIHI tracks. And it's up and down. And in many cases, Ontario doctors, even the specialists, are not best compensated, even though that total number for compensation is highest at that level.
So they have a point when they say they work very, very hard.
Absolutely,
to get paid.
absolutely. I mean, those CIHI data do tell us that Ontario doctors are, by definition of how many services they are and how much they're billing, are very hard working. So it's an interesting thing to look at, and certainly, you know, I think we'll see a lot happening over this topic in the next little while, because it's you know, are they about to go back into negotiations or not? It's a big issue.
Okay. And do you see that that affecting, I guess, how because the government so far in their speeches seems to have elided, I don't know if that's the right word, at this point.
Yeah.
Do you think that doctors are doing an adequate job of getting that message out there about how much they're working?
I don't think so, and I'm not sure they ever will, because I think the public has a hard time grasping how doctors compensated. I mean, they see compensation numbers, and really that's the number. You know, when you hear that 368 average compensation, that's how much really they are getting, almost like as a small business person. They have to pay their office assistant, they have to pay for all sorts of things out of that. So it's a little bit of a tricky number for sure. Yeah. Great. Should we hop to the next topic?
Sure.
So the next topic is mirror touch synesthesia. So what is that?
So synesthesia is obviously a phenomenon where your senses get crossed in a sense. So people see numbers or think of numbers and colors. They can sometimes smell different ideas or associated with different smells or trigger different smells. Mirror touch synesthesia is actually a rarer form of that, and what it essentially is, scientists don't really understand the mechanism behind it, but they think it is like a heightened form of empathy. So if I were to see somebody get poked or jabbed or punched, you feel a mirrored sensation in that part of your body.
Okay.
And interestingly, there's actually a doctor who works for Harvard.
And that's the one you wrote about in the current issue?
Yes.
Okay.
So he's actually a neurologist. His name is Joel Salinas, and he was profiled last year by a magazine in the States called Pacific Standard, and it got a huge amount of attention. I mean, it's one thing to be a person, I guess, who may see this stuff on the street and have a difficult time coping, but physicians are obviously in more extreme situations a lot of the time.
So what is Dr. Salinas experiencing?
So sorts of things he's experiencing are sort of like I said, if he sees a patient, getting tapped on the knee with a reflex hammer, for example, he'll see that sensation and he'll feel a similar sensation in his own knee. Interestingly, it doesn't actually matter if the patient is actually feeling those things. It's strictly visual, so he'll pick up on.
So even if he's watching a video, the patient's not there?
Yes. So even if he's watching a video,
Wow.
he will. I mean, when he goes to movies and this sort of thing, he one of the things that he said is that they take on almost this like dream-like quality. He gets totally immersed in them, and he almost can't get out. The other interesting thing to note about his specific case, and I don't know if this is the case across the board for mirror touch synesthetes, but he can also pick up on sensations based on inanimate objects. Now, this is a little bit weird, and this actually wasn't in the piece, but for example, if he sees a lamppost, he'll actually feel his body being elongated. If he sees a car coming, and he focuses intently on that car, he'll feel his face, I think the way he described it, morphing into the shape of like the headlights. It's very strange, but that's also tremendously beneficial to him in some clinical scenarios because he can choose where he focuses his attention, and this is obviously a skill he's had to hone for himself. There was
Extremely empathetic doctor, really.
Yes,
Yeah.
and there was one really interesting anecdote in the Pacific Standard piece where he talked about one time during his residency having to deal with a patient, a very gruesome situation, who had his arm sort of ripped off by a train, and that, as you can imagine, would be overwhelming for somebody who's dealing with these similar sorts of sensations. But he also had a chance to focus on, say, the shirt sleeve as opposed to what the patient was feeling. So actually, I believe he's coming out with a book now that'll be out, I think, in about the fall or so. I'm not 100% sure about that, but we'll definitely be keeping an eye on him to find out more about that condition.
Well, interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Well, great. I think that's it for us. So as usual, you can get information about the Medical Post or downloading the tablet from our website, CanadianHealthCareNetwork.ca. That's great. Thanks.